First of all, thank you so much. That was very efficient. I mean, that was a very old school to just hop on the phone and be like, yeah, let's plan it. What time? What's the discussion is going to be about? I appreciate it. I worked with a couple of Irish people here in Canada, in Toronto, on a couple of projects, and it was a very straightforward approach, pragmatic, organized, but at the same time, humble. So I appreciate it. Thank you.
I'll talk. Yeah, fine.
Connor, before we start, I just want to present you because that podcast is going to be translated to Russian, so more people in Ukraine and Russia can see and hear what we're discussing here. So just for people that are watching us, I'm here today with Connor Lenihan, a former Irish Minister for Science, Technology and Innovation, and a Vice President of Skolkovo Foundation for Innovation and Science from 2011 and 2015. Is that correct? Have I missed anything?
No, that's fine. That's me. Yes.
Connor, I want to start with something that a lot of people are curious and a lot of people are trying now to analyze the situation and understand what's happening. The reason why I wanted to have this discussion with you is because you have political experience and commercial business experience. So as the President of the United States, Donald Trump. He had a business commercial experience, and also he's the second time the President of the United States. I liked a lot. I definitely understand that was a pre-election rhetorics, but I like his dedication and consistency when it came to the fact that he wants to end the war and the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. He also said that he's going to be able to resolve it in 24 hours and that the war will never or would have never started if he was the president during the time that the war have started. It's been almost 6 months and we have seen some progress. I mean, the United States had direct conversations and negotiations with Russian officials. They have met multiple times. So that's a progress by itself because the Democrats haven't even talked with Russians. So they had no exit plan how to finish that conflict or help any side to get to any resolution. So I think that's already progress. But that being said, the conflict hasn't ended. The war hasn't ended despite that goodwill. How would you assess Trump's approach, progress, Trump's administration so far in regards to ending or resolving the Ukrainian-Russian conflict?
I think he's made best efforts. I think obviously he's something of an impresario in his own right. He's a businessman, an investor, and I suppose in the election said he'd make 2 calls within 24 hours and he would put an end to the war both in Ukraine and, of course, in Gaza. And I think a lot of people thought, yeah, perhaps that was possible, that a man of his experience in business, of doing deals, his book published called The Art of Doing the Deal. But obviously politics is a lot more grinding, I suppose, than business. And I think that's part of the challenge for anybody who comes from a business background into the political sphere, is that you need an awful lot of patience. There's a lot of moving parts, and nowhere more so than in a putative peace process. We had one here in Ireland, which roughly began around 1992 and was only fully resolved in a sense with the formal agreement by 1998. So when you have a lot of moving parts, a lot of interests, a lot of people who, are very wedded to their position, it's very difficult to pull these things off. And of course, you have to have a willingness. And when you look at the efforts that have been made in Ukraine, it seems you're seeing a kind of an entrenched face-off between the Ukrainian desire that their full sovereignty as it was before the conflict began would be respected and that the Russian troops would leave Ukraine. And then you've got the Russian position, which is almost diametrically the opposite, which is they want to retain everything, including the provinces that they would say are pro-Russian or ethnically or culturally Russian.
And they have also added those territories into their constitution, so it's going to be quite hard now to reverse that action.
Yes, and I think that's where we're at with a complete stand-up. I think one of the things that's possible now really is that there is signs that the more intractable problem in Palestine, Gaza, Israel versus Iran, I mean, he has acted swiftly and rather decisively, I think, with the airstrikes against the Iranian nuclear capability or the production system. Uh, Obviously the jury's out as to whether that will bring the Iranians to the table, but they have come to the table, and there is a cessation of those hostilities. And I suppose one only hopes that there's some sort of follow-on cessation and negotiation in that particular theater about Gaza as well, and then the Ukraine, obviously. I think there's obvious frustration in the Trump side at both sets. He had that colorful phrase there recently where he kind of cursed and said, like,
Yeah.
these people don't know what they're doing. And I think that frustration is reflected also in the situation in Ukraine, that, there's a feeling or sense that nobody wishes to give up or surrender their position.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's correct.
I don't know. I mean, I do rather fear. I thought mistakenly, as it turned out, when this broke out, this war invasion started in February, what was it, 3 years ago, that the Russians would follow their own words, in effect. They said it was a small temporary operation, military operation, not a war. It's turned into a war, not a temporary military operation. And I think there was a real opportunity for peace in February, March, after the invasion. I think there was a real opportunity there. I'm not blaming anybody on either side. I think the Turks were involved in trying to assist a peace process at that early stage. But I think there's been an element of hubris on
Connor,
both sides.
I just want to interrupt you here. I apologize. But in terms of blaming anyone, I don't know which month you're referring to, but they had the Istanbul talks, and then the Prime Minister of Britain, the name flew off my head, showed up and said,
Boris Johnson, yes.
Boris
yes.
Johnson, he came into Ukraine and he said, no, guys, let's keep fighting. Can he be the guy to be blamed for the continuation? Because just like you're saying, they were very close to have a formal agreement to stop the war.
Well, opinions differ on that, but yes, I understand that Mr. Boris Johnson, the then Prime Minister of Britain, apparently not on his own back, if you like, but presumably with the okay or the approval of the United States,
Of course.
encouraged Mr. Zelensky not to step at that stage. And I don't know. I mean, in the fog of war, there's a lot of propaganda. So I don't know how real the opportunity was, but I certainly think that was the opportunity to do it. I think once you get into a long war scenario, I think it almost suits the Russians to keep prolonging it because they are the bigger power. They're adjacent logistically to the conflict zone where it's happening, and they can probably grind on for quite a long time, perhaps much longer than Ukraine can, because it's a smaller country. And of course, as you know, already we're seeing a sort of weakening in the Western support for the Ukrainian position. And so, it'll be interesting. But I do think that from Trump's own point of view, politically, he has to start showing results both in the Middle East and Ukraine, because he made a big promise. And as you know, in politics, when you make big promises, the public are very keen to see that you redeem those promises. So I'd be positive and optimistic. I think there is a possibility of peace. And I think that electorally, I think Donald Trump really does need to produce something before he runs into midterm elections
to the Senate. That's in terms of the possibility. What do you think is that possibility? What are the chances, and what the sides should do, and what the Trump's administration should do to get closer to either a potential ceasefire or a full war resolution with a full agreement?
But I think the problem here is you need to have a cessation, either a series of ceasefires, which allow people to talk. I don't think you can talk while violence is continuing. I think it's very, very difficult. And I think, there needs to be some sort of precondition that people commit to a durable ceasefire, maybe only for 3 months or 4 months. And then.
So the ceasefire comes first.
Yeah, I think a ceasefire has to come first, and then you can get into substantial talks, and I suppose leverage can be brought to bear by bigger powers like the United States, the European Union, China, whoever. But there's a good record, with many countries, Qatar, Turkey, and I think even the Chinese have made efforts here as well. So I think a lot of pressure needs to be brought to bear, I think principally it'll have to come from the United States. I don't see the European Union being strong enough as an entity politically or in sovereignty terms to be able to manufacture a peace agreement. And as you know, the European Union, for all sorts of reasons, is almost 100% behind Ukraine. So I don't think the Russians will trust an EU brokered peace. I think the states probably, or the Chinese, or a combination of the states and the Chinese, might be able to produce something.
I want to talk with you also about the EU and Russia relationship because I think you have great experience in that direction too. But before we go there, Trump is still trying to maintain a neutral stance to remain as a moderator and mediator of that potential peace negotiations. So he's avoiding to proceed with any further sanctions against Russia. He's saying, and his team is saying as well, like they're claiming that if we will go forward with more sanctions against the Russians, we won't have an opportunity to continue talking with them about any potential peace resolutions. But what I want to ask you about, because you have a great commercial experience, sanctions. Russia have been sanctioned a lot since the beginning of the war. And a lot of experts and a lot of politicians were saying Russian economy is going to collapse tomorrow. Russian economy is going to collapse in a week, in a month, in a year. We haven't seen yet Russian economy collapsing. What is that with those sanctions? How much are they harming Russian economy? Or maybe the opposite is true. Maybe they're uniting Russian economy. Maybe there's more internal self-produce and growth that help Russia continue, because we haven't seen that full. What's the deal behind the sanctions and the result that I think the Europeans and the Western allies were hoping for never happened?
Well, I think there's been a long record from the European Union and what we call the Western powers of what I would call misplaced sanctions, sanctions that don't, in effect, have the effect that they were forecast to do. I think that's very obvious when you look at the first set of sanctions that were applied when Russia took the Crimea. And in the period of time when those European and Western sanctions kicked in relation to Crimea, Russia went from having to import food to achieving virtually full food security. In other words, they upped their agricultural output and production. That was a goal, by the way, that Putin had set out way before the conflict started in Crimea, and that was achieved very swiftly. So I suspect that the Russian economy is now performing better because a number of different things that were clear deficits in the economy are now being fixed. So in that sense, I suspect the Russians have benefited or gained from the sanctions. They've, my knowledge from my period there at the time of the Crimea invasion was that they instructed their companies, both state and private, to diversify their trade and investment footprint away from the European Union. So they've ended up investing much more heavily in the Far East, China, and of course, the other countries in the world who are not participants in the sanctions. And I think this is something that it's an inconvenient fact that people don't like acknowledging because of the propaganda that's generated by a war effort.
Yeah.
But 80% of the world population reflected in countries are not participant in the sanctions. So there's this kind of, I suppose, a fallacy or delusional thing going on in the Western mind that
I think there is a new reality that the West haven't accepted yet.
Everybody is participant in sanctions. They're not. It's only 20% of the world's population reflected in countries are actually sanctioning Russian produce or Russian exports or Russian investment and Russian people as well. So, that leaves them with, right picking still to trade and invest in. And they've done that.
Yeah.
They've diversified their investment profile. The Russians are more or less gone from Europe now. There was a time where they used to describe London as Londistan, there were so many Russians there. That's not the case anymore. In fact, they're very visibly absent or gone. So, I think that's reflected all over Europe. Not necessarily good news for Europe. I think one of the most harmful effects of these, I would call misplaced sanctions or not very well thought out ones is that the sanctions themselves cause huge turmoil to what is the European Union's biggest engine economy, and that's Germany. German industry has been brought to its knees because of these sanctions. So, in effect, the sanctions that were applied here to Russia have been self-harming from an EU point of view, perhaps not so self-harming in the United States because of their own, shale gas and
Of
and
course.
other. They're not dependent as the Europeans on the Russian gas. So I think for all sorts of reasons, we do need this conflict to end rather quickly, particularly as I speak, from here in the European Union. I think it's very much needed that this conflict is brought to an end. Of course, you can see one of the other outcomes of this has been that now a lot of European Union countries are being compelled to increase their defense spending in response to the, if you like, the fear of instability in Europe and the lack of funds to defend it. So the Americans are saying very explicitly, as we can see for many years, Trump, not only Trump, by the way, previous presidents made the same point, but that the Europeans have to uh, provide their own security in future. It's not really, how would you call it, sustainable for a whole continent to expect that the Americans should hold an umbrella over them every time it rains, in metaphorical terms. So, I think that that's one of the huge consequences of this. But a lot of these European countries are going to struggle greatly to achieve those targets that they committed
Five
to in
percent,
NATO
yeah, 5% from their GDP.
because
Yeah.
their economies have taken a right hit from the war already through the oil and gas effect.
Connor, in terms of if we go back, because as you're saying, Europe is suffering, European countries are suffering economically from that conflict. Obviously, Russia is suffering and Russia had to adjust and diversify. Yeah, they became more self sufficient, but they still have economical challenges and problems. In that regards, we all understand that it was way better for everybody to just continue growing business, continue the trade, continue the expansion of, one party to another in terms of the investment and so on and so forth. Do you see in the future, the near future, 5, 10 years, that European Union, Russians, Ukrainians are reversing the trend, exiting the conflict, and will be able to go back to the negotiation table and start again trading, investing into each other country, and building back that economical prosperity that they used to have before war? I mean, there is a lot of European countries that used to invest in Russia, used to invest in Russian infrastructural projects. Vice versa, like you're saying, in terms of Russia, we've seen a lot of Russian oligarchs, rich people moving into European capitals, investing money, buying real estate, investing in business, and so on and so forth. Like that was a win-win for everybody. What has happened that have led them to drop that business approach and get into a more political, geopolitical agenda of fighting each other?
I just think that there's a huge misunderstanding about Russia in the West and particularly in the European Union, a misunderstanding in the sense that people have not studied or really focused in depth on the aspirations, expectations, or outlook of the Russians. I happened to live there for 4 years, and obviously I did a lot of business in the Ukraine while I was there as well. And I think people genuinely in the Western world don't understand the kind of society that you have in Ukraine or Russia or the ambitions. And I think one of the people who only died last year, Henry Kissinger, warned very specifically and many times, right up to the year that he died, that the West had to be very, very careful in destabilizing or getting involved in undermining or destabilizing the Russians in their own broad sphere of influence, which is obviously Ukraine falls within that category. And I think that's where, if you like, that we really, I suppose, the West certainly would need to learn from this that preventative diplomacy is always better. Um, Russia has interest in that part of the world, and they can't be ignored. I mean, I think it was Trump pointed out in his first term that 10%, is it 90% of the world's nuclear weaponry is owned jointly or separately by the United States and
Yeah.
Russia. So, Russia may be a regional power rather than a global power nowadays, but in terms of nuclear weapons, they're a global power.
Hmm.
And that has to be factored into the equation. I think that the prospects for a solution here are not great when you look at it at the moment. There doesn't seem to be any willingness on the combatant side, be it the Russians or the Ukrainians, to really pursue the prospect of peace here. I think that's very unfortunate for Ukraine, because I think the longer this goes on, the more likely that the Russians are going to get to hold or keep on to what we might call the territorial gains that they've made in the war conflict itself. And I do really passionately believe, as I said earlier, that if something had arisen or could have been done in February, March, after this invasion begun, I think that would have been better. But what was very dispiriting from my perspective, just looking at it from outside, was that there was no peace movement in Europe when this
That's
happened.
correct.
This was one of the most extraordinary things that I've ever seen.
Neither in Ukraine.
Normally, from the far left or the peaceniks emerge when there's conflict in the world and say, this has to be brought up. But there was none. In fact, at one stage, I remember the wife of the Irish president suggested this fact back in that period after the thing had begun. And she was sort of savaged in the public media for even suggesting, so in other words, peace to date has been presented as that by sponsoring or supporting the notion of peace, it's automatically seen at that stage, not so anymore, I think, but thankfully, as a kind of capitulation to Russia's aggression. I mean, Russia will pay a price for this. So it's not like the case that, things can go back to normal very quickly. I think that sanctions, by the way, even if there was a successful peace process, it would take time to even dismantle the sanctions, and it will take time for people to get used or adjust themselves to either investing again in Russia. So I don't think this is like a consequence-free conflict. I think there's consequences for Russia for having done this in the first place. I think there'll be serious trust issues in relation to Russia and its role in the world following this conflict.
For a long time.
For a long time, yeah. But I think one of the big things that perhaps the Western powers and some of the people who like to push and egg on the war and the no compromise position, the thing they forget is that one of the most interesting developments of this whole conflict is that it has pushed Russia into a far bigger alliance with China than perhaps they might have otherwise wanted had this conflict not started. So I think that's a kind of an interesting one. I'm not sure that the Russians are very comfortable in being hugely dependent on China, both in trade and investment terms, and nor indeed as a customer for their oil and gas, So
you think they would be happy to diversify back?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I do think so. Yeah. And I mean, at the end of the day, the tragedy here is that, that Ukraine and Russia are European countries. They're not, what I mean? They're very much European countries. I know Putin and the Russians, even when I was there, used to present themselves as a Eurasian power. But I mean, frankly speaking, when you look around the table, as I did at business meetings in Russia, there's not much Asian in it at all. It's effectively a very European, Slavic country with a Slavic culture. And of course, it has its own diversity because of the various, stands that are included and
regions and everything. Yeah.
Yeah, but the heart of Russia is very European. I didn't feel uncomfortable living there. I didn't feel like I was in anywhere that was very much different.
You still felt like you were like in that part of that European family.
Yeah, it is. I mean, and the same applies in Ukraine. Of course, it's a different language, different culture, but you can kind of sense that it's a similar place,
Connor, you've done business with the Ukrainians, you've done business with the Russians, you've been in both countries. I think you have, from the years that you've been there and from the years that you have engaged with both of the nations and with both of the countries, I think you have a good understanding of, their mentality, their approach, their life philosophy. And something that you have said earlier that I 100% agree with is that there has been a lot of misunderstanding, and that's why conflicts, war, even like conflicts between people, it happens because of misunderstanding. There is less chances of somebody having a bad will and they're coming deliberately to hurt you. A lot of conflicts simply arise out of misunderstanding. That being said, what do you think Russians want at this point? A lot of people are accusing them, a lot of countries are accusing them that they just want to occupy the entire Ukraine. They just want to continue as much as and as long as it will take. And then they will start war in different European countries and see if they can provoke NATO and see if they can, like, push forward and forward and forward and so on and so forth. What do you think? What is your take? What do you think Russians actually want? And how do you think they're going to be okay with exiting that conflict? Because obviously they don't want to lose the face. They don't want to capitulate. I also understand, as you've mentioned earlier, that they will have consequences. The whole country will have consequences. But what do they want at this point, and how we can potentially, give a recipe for the people who are in charge, for the people who can make an influence, to what they should come to the table of negotiations with the Russians when they are meeting with Russians? Because I think there is a lot of time from what I'm hearing from what I'm hearing from the media and from the news, is that simply nobody understands Russians, and that's why they cannot communicate. Like, the communication is broken because, just like you've mentioned, the West does not understand Russia, and maybe Russia does not understand the West. How they can meet halfway, what compromises each side should do, what understanding should each side learn about each other for them to start that effective, healthy communication to resolve their conflicts, also between the Russia and Ukraine and Russia and the European Union.
Well, I think the template or the basis for a successful peace brokering here lies in the actual paperwork and memoranda that were not so much signed, but I'm told broadly agreed before Mr. Boris Johnson arrived. I understand, and I don't know whether this is true or not. Of course, it probably would be vigorously denied in Kiev, but that there was broad agreement on the Zelensky side to sign that particular agreement, which I understand meant that the Russians would pay a significant amount of money for a long-term lease over Crimea, and they would hold on to or allow some of those eastern segments or parts of the current day, present day Ukraine to enjoy a level of independence way beyond what they had then.
Yeah.
As you say, they've now constitutionally or otherwise asserted this is part of Russia. So, I think we're back to that agreement again, that, that has to be the basis for an agreement. There's other significant demands from the Russian side, which I'm not so sure that can be satisfied, but this idea of that, that Ukraine would be somehow, in the same sense as Finland was previously, not demilitarized or neutral, and that wouldn't pose a threat or appear to be a threat to Russia. I think the Russians can and will be brought to the table. It's just a question of who's going to do that. I do think that this man, Steve Witkoff, that is a developer, businessman.
Yeah, he's a developer from US, and Trump appointed him to be his negotiator when it comes to resolving the conflicts.
I think he's quite an effective operator. He's been involved in both conflicts in the Middle East and obviously the one in Ukraine. I believe, from what we know and what they've published instead, is that the Americans are looking at a very long-term agreement that would secure a very peaceful and presumably profitable relationship between Russia and the United States. From the American perspective, that I think the Americans have it in their mind that they need to take Russia back out of what we would call the sphere or the influence of the Chinese. And I think that's the big strategic picture here, why Trump is being so forceful about the need to achieve peace. We all believed he had some respect or connection to Putin. That's proven not to be the case so far. But again, I think the patience is wearing thin, both in the Middle East and the Ukraine. And I think it would be very dangerous for any of the players, Zelensky or Putin, or the Russians or the Ukrainians, to, if you like, wear that patience thin that is there in the United States. Because I think, it could be extremely costly for Russia and for Ukraine if they don't advance into what I would say is the opportunity that the Trump presidency is offering, because really there's broad agreement now. There was a lot of hostility at the beginning of the Trump presidency being directed at Mr. Zelensky, as you know, in that office meeting they had, which I think was very ill advised by Zelensky, but that the things that he was saying, the approach he was taking, I don't think it was the right approach in public to take with the American president on that occasion. But they managed to get over that. They had a very successful meeting, apparently, at the funeral in Rome for the last pope. So
Yep.
I think Trump is pragmatic. He does, and of course he does have grudges. I don't believe, for instance, that the Trump administration have entirely forgiven Zelensky and the Ukrainians for the assistance or support they offered to Joe Biden in the election campaign. So, that's natural. When I was in politics, and maybe it was you trying to uh, cozy up to me after the election, but you were canvassing for my rival, you wouldn't get too much sympathy
Of course,
from me.
we're all
And
human
so,
beings. Yeah.
and I think that's fully understandable. But like, in fairness to Trump and JD Vance, they got over that, and they want to deal pragmatically with, Zelensky as the current president, and get on with things. But I think it's very risky if it's allowed to drag on. I think it's risky for both sides because I think with the slow up in Western support for Ukraine, we just don't know. The Russians could make significant further military gains. And then, you're into a separate scenario, and I do think that there's a war weariness, both with both conflicts that are going on in the world, Middle East and Ukraine. I think there's a huge war weariness entering the picture. I think a lot of people, particularly the swing that's happened now to the more conservative side of the picture in the European Union, I think the more conservative people that have got in the last few years in Europe are very much not for the war, in the same way that I don't believe that there's a huge level of support amongst the Republicans in Congress for continually shelling out money for the conflict in Ukraine.
They're more pro-business and more pragmatic, and hopefully they will be able to set a new tone for geopolitics and relationships and resolve as many conflicts as they can to just bring everybody back to doing business and not wars. Connor, for the past 20, 30 years, Ireland have bloomed like just massively with the corporate tax systems that you guys have implemented, social programs, migration programs. Like, the country was just in a rapid growth. A lot of big companies like Google, Facebook, Microsoft opened offices in Ireland, in Dublin. And you haven't just witnessed that as a citizen or as a resident. You've been particular in the government, I'm assuming, participating as a minister in all that growth. So I want to ask you if we can give a couple of advices for Ukrainians, what Ukraine as a country can do now to experience any sort of growth. I mean, before the war, before the conflict, before the 2014-13, Ukraine was just profiting from being a logistical hub. Transferring goods from point A to point B. They haven't had to do much. They were just making money out of that. Like, their geographical location is excellent in terms of just making money on logistical business. At this moment, Ukraine is not doing so well. They have just officially 7 million refugees, Ukrainian refugees, living in Europe, but I'm sure the number is way higher. This is just the official number because also more people haven't just left Europe. They moved further to Canada, US, Australia, other countries. So there is definitely way more. They have a demographical collapse. Like, they're missing a lot of people. They're at war. So obviously it's hard for them to think strategically how to develop and become a prosperous country again. But with your experience and what you're witnessing happening in Ukraine now, and you also understand Ukrainians and you did business in Ukraine, how do you think Ukraine as a country can become successful again? What should they do? What should they invest into? What political strategy they should have to exit that collapse, if we can say so, and start growing and rebuilding and become a successful European country?
Well, I believe Ukraine, and I went there with the German businessman actually a month or two before the war broke out or the invasion started. It was very interesting. dealing with a German businessman who was looking to seek and secure investment in building renewable energy. In Ukraine, Ukraine has a huge advantage in this area of renewable energy, particularly solar and wind power. Unlike a lot of European countries, where if you try to put up this infrastructure, you often face planning objections, and there aren't. In terms of space, it's very hard to secure vast tracts of land. And I understand there are very big land holdings still in the ownership of the state in Ukraine. And so I think it's an ideal country to develop and help the European Union in particular. Germany, I suppose, is the classic example where they stopped their nuclear power, but Ukraine has nuclear power and it has the potential to be a very big hub for the European Union in terms of supply of energy and renewable energy. And that's a huge opportunity because, as you know, the Germans rather foolishly closed down their nuclear facilities. So, all of the European countries have big challenges in terms of energy. And I think this could be a massive opportunity. And, the businessman that I was dealing with on that occasion had said to me that the Ukraine government then, before the conflict started, were planning to move along this particular line. They'd introduced an interesting tariff structure for people to come and invest in renewable energy. And I traveled up to the border right beside there, Belarus, to a particular location. I met with the mayor up there, and the whole thing was very positive. In fact, I was contemplating at that point in time, because this business opportunity might have been so big that I might have to move myself to Kiev, to oversee the business and sort of be part of the opportunity. So I think those kind of opportunities will be back. I mean, you have good nuclear facilities as well. So I think like the energy side would be very, very strong. Obviously, when I went to work in Russia, I used to come down quite a lot to Kiev and do business with business people there in Kiev. I think the other area that you're very strong, obviously, is food and agriculture. The food supply. Not for no reason in the old Soviet Union, Ukraine was the breadbasket of the old Russia.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's huge opportunity there. Obviously, there's going to be issues there with our friends in Poland, because as you know, Poland and Hungary
It's a competition for them.
had problems with that. But look, I think it's a strong area where they have an embedded advantage. The other thing I found interesting, a very good Jewish friend of mine, a very significant businessman back in the United States. When I was working in Moscow, he came over to me and we went down to Kiev, and he was employing at that stage, which is back in 2011, 200 to 300 software developers in Kiev. So, like, you've got good qualified people. I mean, this is a thing that I saw in Russia. Obviously, it applied to a certain extent also in Ukraine, that the strength of the STEM subjects, science, technology, engineering, and math, is very strong. Paradoxically, in the old Soviet countries, there was a big premium put on science, and the STEM subjects tend to be better, and they tend to have better qualified people there. So a lot of the people who were investing with Skolkova when I was there were trying to tap in. They were looking at the market opportunity in Russia, but they were also trying to tap into and if you like, harvest talent for these large companies, because there's a massive shortage of good, available, and let's be honest with you, affordable engineering talent. And so a number of the companies that invested in Moscow when I was there were pretty upfront about it. They said, look, we're not interested in doing too much business here, but we want to get our hands on and get into the supply line of very good software, computer, and industrial engineers that you have in that part of the world. So, that's a significant opportunity too for Ukraine. I think one of the good things that will hopefully come out of the process, if there is a peace process, hopefully now in the next year, is that you will start seeing people looking at the prospect of, if the Russians insist on retaining those places that they held, well, then it's fairly clear that Ukraine will be on a trajectory to join the European Union. And I think with European Union accession, it would be very strong for the economy of Ukraine. There's absolutely no doubt about that. You talked about the Irish miracle, what happened in Ireland. You can't forget, there were two things that made Ireland very successful. One was joining the European Union in 1973, opening up the large markets. Like, we're a small country, very much on the periphery of Europe, an island off the island of England.
Yeah.
We gained enormously from the peace process, and there was a huge investment surge after the IRA ceased its violence in 1994. And that was a big, big spur for us to finesse or complete the peace process, because we knew when we were out there trying to sell Ireland as a location for investment, even though the conflict was happening in the British part of the island, Northern Ireland, there weren't that many overspill effects. But investors saw that, look, 70 miles up the road, there's this big conflict going on. So we reaped a huge investment boom as a result of the peace in Ireland. And then, obviously, Brexit was a big challenge for us, because our biggest trading customer is still the UK. But again, paradoxically, when the British pulled out, we became the only Eurozone full member of the Eurozone with English speaking. So, we got a lot of more investment in the last few years because of Brexit. So we've gained from that. And I think there's great skill sets in Ukraine. When I was there, obviously politically, institutionally, there's been a big concern, not just in Russia, but particularly in Ukraine, about the corruption issue. I mean, that's fairly well referred to. I think there's an opportunity even, and I know that Mr. Zelensky and even Mr. Poroshenko were moving to try to reduce the levels of corruption that were applied in Ukraine. In fact, the irony of it is, when I told some of my colleagues in the office in Moscow back in the pre-2011 period that I was going down to do business in Ukraine, they were looking at me after, are you right in the head? Those people are so corrupted. So, that, that, see, when I tell that to people here, they kind of look at me and think, well, like, if the Russians think that place is very corrupt, what are we to think? So, look, I think these things can be solved. I think if there's a commitment to invest in the place, once peace is brought about. But you see, I think everybody keeps getting obsessive about NATO membership. I think the more important thing for Ukraine is actually membership of the European Union and an American guarantee of the safety. Because a European security guarantee is meaningless. We know how little the Europeans spend on weaponry. We know that the Europeans and the European Union are very dependent militarily on American support if there is a conflict. So, the best outcome is and I think, to be fair to Trump, with this minerals deal that he's signed, I don't know what the status of that is now, but I think with that minerals deal is very, very significant, because if America has a vested interest to redeem the benefits that would come with, for instance, a mineral or resource deal, that effectively gives Ukraine a very strong security guarantee, because clearly the Americans
Makes sense,
don't invest in a place where the Russians are just going to march back in and take all the resources that they've carefully curated there. So, look, I think that's much more significant. I think and we found that also, by the way, in relation to peace in Ireland, that not just the American intervention to push both the British and others to come to the table, but also it was the fact that they appointed George Mitchell, who ultimately ended up chairing the peace talks between the different parties. He arrived first, and I met him actually the first week that he arrived over dinner in Dublin in the American embassy. He was first appointed as an economic envoy. So behind the American brokerage around getting to a position of peace in Ireland was a very explicit, as opposed to implicit, guarantee that the Americans would invest in Ireland if this particular peace came about. And I think Trump has already started that sort of commitment with Ukraine, that if the peace happens, then the American investment and money will come in. I was, many years ago, my first job as a minister, when I was appointed to the Department of Foreign Affairs as a minister, my first visit was to the Ukraine, to Kiev. Our president at the time, a lady called Mary Mackless, had broken her leg in a skiing accident and was not able to attend the inauguration of Yushchenko after
Yeah.
the famous Orange Revolution. So I was told at short notice that I had to go to Kiev. It wasn't particularly uh, suit me at the time, but I had a very good time over there. Obviously, that was an amazing moment to be in the square for the inauguration of Yushchenko, the big Orange Revolution. You had Yulia Tymoshenko, and it's very interesting for me. It was my first week or two in the Department of Foreign Affairs, and I got to meet the then head of NATO, Yakup, and there was Colin Powell, now sadly deceased. Colin Powell was there on his last event as Secretary of State in the United States. So I had a lovely 45-minute conversation with him in the palace after the big speech in the square by Yushchenko. And it was very, very interesting. But to kind of get you a sense, there was such hope and optimism at that time because of what had happened. And it was huge. Just interesting that you should be in Canada because there was a huge presence of Canadian Ukrainians at the inauguration. There was a huge number of parliamentarians, I think, from Canada who were of
Yeah.
Ukrainian origin. There was a huge expatriate number of business people, and these people were wildly optimistic about the investment prospects, and and they were clearly there to make sure that they would be beneficiaries of this, new situation. So I think it's a pity that didn't work out. It's a pity that you had so many different changes and different how would you call it color revolutions. I don't know what you call them, but I think there was great hope and optimism at that time. It was dissipated by a number of political factors related to Russia as well. I think that can happen. There's a huge Ukrainian diaspora. I think the big strength we've had in our peace arrangement and in our investment outcomes has been the presence of a very active Irish diaspora in North America, both Canada and the United States, who, they do come back. Yeah, one of the biggest features of our boom years before the 2008 to 2011 financial and global crash in the economy in Ireland was the sheer volume of returning immigrants. And this was a huge stimulus to our economy because when our boom started, we'll say around the year 98, 1999, we were beginning to have huge uh, labor market squeezes. We were running out of qualified people. So what really assisted us was these returning immigrants now seeing a great opportunity back home in Ireland to get jobs because of the inward investment we were seeing and the big changes around the domestic economy as well. That fed into a very benign situation where you had people who were exposed at middle to senior level outside Ireland, because Ireland is a small place. And in relative terms, Ukraine, while it's much bigger country than Ireland, it's also a smaller, more peripheral economy to, we'll say, the likes of Germany or Italy or Spain or whatever. And, if you have people abroad who are willing to punt and bring their money back and invest and locate themselves back in the country, that experience is invaluable because the people who are working, say, in the UK, America, Australia, who came back to Ireland were far better qualified people than if they had stayed all that time in the Irish economy, which is not, doesn't have the great depth and strength of the United States or Germany, so that this will be a very distinct advantage. I know everybody is hugely sad at the presence of so many Ukrainians who've been forced to leave because of this war. But you'll find that if stability is achieved and there's investment from the United States and Europe, of course, that you'll start seeing people coming back and adding their newfound skill sets. I mean, we see it here in Ireland. We're at a kind of a squeezed labour market again here because things are going so well for us. And the Ukrainians are already in work. Like when we say we've had problems with huge waves of migration into Ireland, mainly, by the way, the huge percentage of Ukrainians have come here, but all of those Ukrainians are fitting into jobs very, very quickly here. It's not,
it's easy for them to integrate.
the real issue around immigration is obviously the kind of African Asian sort of immigration into the country, and the cultural effects of that. But
Because the culture is different and it's harder for them to integrate, and it's just a bigger difference.
yeah, and then the host population starts getting kind of anxious and phobic or whatever you want to describe it. I don't want to call it racist because I think that's a word that's thrown around too easily, in public debate. People have
a lot of people are very happy to play that card, but it's simply the difference between the cultures, and it's harder to build the bridge when the distance is further.
Yeah, but so I think there's great prospects for Ukraine, and look, it's probably the case that this trade-off or this problem. I mean, as you know, the Orange Revolution was kind of like a pro-Western. I mean, the Russians see it as a pro-Western coup almost. And then Yanukovych came in, and that was like a almost Russian move. And then the next one came, the Maidan, and that was again seen in Russia some sort of counter coup against them and their person, Yanukovych. So I think if this can stop, if you can just bring a stop to that, this coup counter to, that then there is a settled uh, investment environment in Ukraine, and like I couldn't get over it. I was over there literally in October before the invasion with this renewable energy thing, and I met a very good Jewish friend of mine who was living there. They're a big business family there, and we're sitting down over dinner, and in the newspapers in October there was rumors of Russian maneuvers. You know the way the Russians have these maneuvers every October uh, in and around Ukraine, Belarus, and the rumors were going around then of a Russian invasion because of these maneuvers, provocative or otherwise. And I just couldn't believe it. And nobody around the table, in other words, the Western media were saying this could happen, but nobody believed it. And I'm one of the people who said, like, I don't believe this is going to happen. And I was saying that right up to the point where Putin invaded the place. So, like, nobody believed, particularly people who'd lived and worked in Russia, that this kind of foolishness would be entertained. But it was. And I don't think it's in anybody's interest for that to happen again. And most of all in Russia, I mean, as you know, in the middle of this thing, there was an attempted coup by that guy Prigozhin against Putin. It didn't succeed. I don't think any coup would succeed against what we might describe the current regime
Makes
in
sense.
Moscow. But it does make the point that there's instability, and that kind of instability that could present itself in Russia is not in the interest of the West either to happen. We're better off having a stable zone in that part of Europe called Ukraine, Russia. In the two, and I think it's shocking the way it's been allowed to go on for so long. I really can't believe it. I'm having very good friends in both Moscow and Kiev, and Dnipropetrovsk. I traveled down to Dnipro quite a bit as well when I was there. Yeah, there's such talent down there. I was in I don't know if you're aware of this, but the biggest rocket factory for the Soviet Union was based in the Dnipropetrovsk, and they're still producing rockets there. And I remember visiting this facility and saying, like, this is just so enormous. There's internal railroads in the place, and there are there's plenty of, and I met an awful lot on that visit. It was an investment visit for this particular high net worth that wanted to invest there. But the talent and the patterns we were shown on that particular visit, in there's great strength of physics, on the physics side as well in the Ukrainian scene. So, it's not a country that hasn't got talent. It's got plenty of talent, and that's very evident in Ireland. Like they're all in jobs, they're all working hard.
Talent and potential. I agree with you, and hopefully, just like Ireland, when Ukraine will stabilize itself and will get to some peace process, we will be able to see those waves of people coming back to the country. That talent goes back to Ukraine and helps rebuild the Ukrainian infrastructural projects and economy and so on and so forth.
Yeah, and I do think that, but strangely, you might find it strange to say this, but I think that if Ukraine is sufficiently stabilized and built up, it could become a very attractive magnet for even for Russian people to go and work in, because if it's located in the European Union, and
Yeah.
a lot of Russians would choose to live there as well. I don't know how well it would be after this war, but
As they did, honestly, before the war, there was a lot of Russians business. There were a lot of Russian people coming, investing, and working.
yeah, and the same in the Baltic states. There's a lot there as well. So yeah,
Yeah.
so hopefully, we all hope now it'll come to an end soon. Hopefully, Trump will redeem his promise. He said he'd make the 2 phone calls. I think he's now found out that there's a lot more phone calls have to be made. But
He's a little bit behind the schedule. Yeah, there is a couple more phone calls that potentially he needs to do. Connor, thank you so much for your time today. That was my pleasure. I appreciate how quickly we were able to set and organize this. Thank you again.
thank you. Take care. Take care. Best luck.
You
Cheers.
too.